When you imagine ancient Rome, you may think first of emperors, legions, marble statues, or loud public speeches echoing across the forum. But if you lived there, day after day, your life would have been shaped far more by rules that felt dull, repetitive, and unavoidable. These rules governed how you dressed, how you ate, how you walked through the streets, and even how loudly you were allowed to grieve the dead. Many of them seem strange now. Some appear harsh, others feel almost absurd. Yet most of them existed not out of cruelty, but out of fear, practicality, and the slow accumulation of experience in a crowded and fragile world. Rome was not designed all at once. It grew, layer by layer, street by street, law by law. Each generation inherited problems created by the last, and the Roman solution was rarely imaginative. It was administrative. Rules were written because something had gone wrong before. A fire had spread too quickly. A riot had begun at a funeral. A wealthy citizen had shown off too much luxury and stirred resentment. A woman had cried too loudly in public and disrupted the controlled image of civic order, and so a rule followed, dry and specific, enforced by officials who understood that peace depended on routine obedience. One of the most famous examples is the set of laws, now known as the sumptuary laws. These were regulations that limited personal display. You could not wear certain colors unless you belonged to a specific class. Purple, extracted from rare sea snails, was restricted because it symbolized power and wealth. Too much of it worn by the wrong person threatened the visual hierarchy of Roman society. Gold jewelry was limited. The number of guests at a dinner party could be regulated. Even the cost of a meal on certain days was capped. To you, this may sound intrusive, but imagine living in a city where resentment simmered constantly beneath the surface. Rome was filled with veterans who had risked their lives for little reward. Migrants from conquered lands, freed slaves trying to survive, and elites whose wealth grew ever more visible. Excessive luxury was not just tasteless, it was dangerous. It reminded everyone of inequality. The Roman state believed that visible restraint reduced social tension. By making luxury boring and regulated, they hoped to keep envy from turning into violence. Another rule governed how fast you could travel through the city. Carts and wagons were largely banned from the streets during daylight hours. At first glance, this seems inconvenient, but Rome was loud, narrow, and crowded. Streets were often little more than stone corridors between tall buildings. Allowing heavy carts during the day would have meant constant blockages, crushed pedestrians, and endless disputes. By restricting wheeled traffic to the night, the city created a predictable rhythm. During the day, people walked. At night, goods moved. Of course, this brought its own problems. Nighttime in Rome was dark and dangerous. Torches flickered. Criminals moved quietly. Wheels rattled over stone, keeping light sleepers awake. The poet Juvenal complained bitterly about sleepless nights, caused by carts rumbling past his window. Yet even this annoyance was tolerated, because the alternative was chaos during daylight hours. The rule was not about comfort, it was about keeping the city moving at all. Fire regulations reveal another layer of Roman anxiety. Rome burned often. Buildings were packed tightly together. Upper floors were made of wood. Cooking fires burned constantly. To reduce risk, rules required certain materials in construction, limited building heights in some periods, and demanded shared walls that could slow the spread of flames. Homeowners were sometimes required to keep water on hand. After devastating fires, emperors introduced stricter oversight, not out of compassion, but out of fear that destruction led to unrest. Even the act of mourning was regulated. Professional mourners, often women, were hired to cry loudly at funerals. Over time, this practice became so exaggerated that lawmakers stepped in. Excessive wailing, self-injury, and public displays of grief were restricted. Funerals could not block streets for too long. Tombs were regulated in size and location. Death was permitted, but disorder was not. The Roman state wanted grief to be controlled, quiet, and predictable. You also lived under rules about speech. While Rome celebrated rhetoric, there were limits. Speaking ill of powerful figures could bring consequences. Public assemblies were monitored. Certain gatherings required permission. The state feared crowds more than individuals. A single voice could be punished, but a mob could overthrow order entirely. So rules existed to fragment collective action into manageable forms. Even daily eating habits were touched by law. Certain foods were associated with luxury and banned at specific times. This was partly moral, partly economic. Excessive consumption strained supply chains. Grain shortages caused riots. The state distributed grain to citizens not as charity but as stability insurance. Keeping bellies full kept voices quiet. What becomes clear, if you sit with these rules long enough, is that Rome was always afraid of fire, famine, envy, crowds, noise, and change. The laws were not designed to inspire happiness. They were designed to preserve continuity. They made life dull on purpose. Boredom was safer than excitement. As you imagine yourself walking through a Roman street, stepping aside for others, wearing approved clothing, eating regulated meals, and lowering your voice at a funeral, you begin to see how order was maintained, not by constant force, but by endless small constraints. Each rule closed off a possibility. Each restriction narrowed behavior into predictable channels. But rules also created tension. People found ways around them. Wealth hid itself. Morning became private. Nighttime became active. And with every workaround, new rules followed. This quiet struggle between control and adaptation defined Roman life far more than any battle or emperor ever did. So as these strange rules accumulated, shaping the rhythm of daily existence, one question remained unresolved. Did these regulations truly protect Roman society from collapse? Or did they slowly drain the flexibility that might have saved it later? As you continue living within the rules of Rome, you begin to notice that the laws do not simply sit on tablets or scrolls. They reach into your habits and quietly shape how you think. Over time, the rules feel less like commands and more like the natural order of things. You wait your turn because waiting is expected. You dress as others expect you to dress. You learn which behaviors attract attention and which allow you to pass unnoticed. In Rome, invisibility is often a form of safety. Consider the rules surrounding citizenship and names. Roman citizens followed a strict naming structure. Your name immediately revealed your family, your status, and often your political relevance. Freed slaves adopted the names of former masters, signaling gratitude and dependence long after freedom was granted. These conventions were not merely social customs. They were enforced through records and legal recognition. A name told officials how to treat you. It determined your rights, your obligations, and your vulnerability to punishment. This clarity was intentional. Rome feared ambiguity. A society of millions required instant classification: who could vote, who could testify, who could marry legally, who could be tortured during interrogation. All of this depended on status that was made visible through names, clothing, and documentation. Confusion slowed administration. Clarity allowed control to function quietly. You also lived under rules governing time itself. The Roman calendar was not fixed in the way modern calendars are. It was adjusted, manipulated, and occasionally abused. Priests controlled which days were legal for business, public meetings, or court cases. Certain days were forbidden for official action. Others were marked by rituals that paused ordinary life. By controlling time, the state controlled momentum. Delays could be engineered, urgency could be softened, political threats could be postponed, until enthusiasm faded. Even your access to justice was shaped by regulation. Courts operated in public spaces, but participation required knowledge, presence, and endurance. Trials could last hours under the sun. Advocates spoke at length, witnesses waited. The system favored those who could afford time. Rules did not guarantee fairness. They guaranteed procedure. Rome believed that visible process was more important than equal outcomes. If the ritual was followed, the result was accepted, even if it harmed the weak. Rules about housing reveal another quiet logic. Tenement buildings, known as insulae, housed most urban residents. Laws attempted to limit their height, enforce maintenance, and reduce collapse risk. But enforcement was inconsistent. Landlords often ignored regulations. Why were the rules written then? Because the state needed to appear concerned. Responsibility was shifted onto paper. When buildings collapsed, blame could be assigned to violations rather than to systemic neglect. You notice the same pattern in sanitation laws. Latrines were shared, waste flowed through channels beneath streets. Rules governed where refuse could be dumped, and who cleaned which spaces. Fines existed. Inspections occurred occasionally, but the real function of these laws was psychological. They reassured citizens that someone was in charge of filth. Even when conditions remained unpleasant, the presence of regulation created tolerance. Perhaps the most intimate rules concerned the household. The Roman father held legal authority over family members. This power was vast. including control over property, marriage, and in earlier periods, even life and death decisions. Yet this authority was framed by expectation and tradition. Abuse of power brought social consequences. Laws defined the boundaries not to protect the weak directly, but to preserve household stability. A household in chaos threatened neighborhood order. Neighborhood disorder threatened the city. Women lived within layered constraints. Some restrictions limited property rights or public participation. Others protected women from financial exploitation. Marriage contracts spelled out dowries, obligations, and returns. Divorce was regulated but accessible. The system aimed for predictability. Emotional fulfillment was irrelevant. Stability mattered more. Rules also governed leisure. Public games were funded by elites seeking favor. Attendance was free. Behavior inside arenas was monitored. Seating reflected class divisions. Even enjoyment was organized. The crowd was allowed to cheer, but within boundaries. Riots had happened before. The rules existed because excitement, when unmanaged, turned dangerous. You begin to see that Roman law did not aim to perfect life. It aimed to flatten it. Peaks of emotion, wealth, and expression were trimmed. Valleys of suffering were tolerated if they did not disrupt order. This was not cruelty in the dramatic sense. It was indifference elevated into policy. Enforcement varied. Some rules were strict. Others were symbolic. What mattered was their presence. They created a sense that the world was structured. Even when it was unfair, people adjusted behavior not because they loved the law, but because the law made resistance tiring. And yet, within this framework, people survived. They learned routines. They found quiet joys. They bent rules without breaking them. Shopkeepers bribed inspectors. Families mourned softly at home. Wealth was displayed subtly. The system allowed small freedoms as long as they did not challenge the larger shape of control. As Rome expanded, these rules traveled outward. Provinces adopted Roman regulations unevenly. Local customs blended with imperial law. What worked in the city did not always work on the frontier. Tension grew between central authority and local reality. The more rules multiplied, the harder they were to enforce consistently. This raises a deeper question that begins to surface beneath the calm surface of Roman order. When rules exist primarily to maintain appearance rather than adapt to change, do they strengthen a society, or do they quietly prepare it for rigidity and eventual fracture? By the time you reach the later centuries of Rome, the rules no longer feel new or even noticeable. They are simply there, like the stone beneath your feet. Many Romans no longer remember why certain laws were written in the first place. They only know that life has always been lived this way, with limits quietly enclosing every action. The rules have become tradition, and tradition has become habit. This is where Roman regulation reveals its final purpose. It was never meant to inspire loyalty or love. It was meant to slow collapse. Each rule was a weight placed gently on human behavior, pressing it into predictable forms. When Rome was young and expanding, these weights felt manageable. Order supported growth, but as time passed, the same restraints began to resist adaptation. Consider the city itself. Rome had grown vast beyond anything its early lawmakers could have imagined. Yet many of the rules governing construction, sanitation, and movement were inherited from an earlier, smaller city. Fires still spread, buildings still collapsed, streets still clogged. Rather than rethink the system, officials added more regulations. New limits sat atop old ones. Complexity increased. Responsibility blurred. You would notice this most clearly in enforcement. Laws existed, but enforcement depended on local officials, bribes, personal relationships, and political favor. This unevenness bred quiet resentment. The rules applied differently, depending on who you were. Wealthy citizens absorbed fines easily. Poor citizens faced punishment more directly. Over time, belief in fairness weakened, even as belief in procedure remained. The Roman response to disorder was almost always administrative. If grain riots occurred, distribution schedules were adjusted. If corruption spread, new offices were created to monitor it. If officials abused power, rules were written defining proper behavior. Rarely did Rome question whether the structure itself had grown too rigid. The solution was always another layer. Even the military was shaped by this mindset. Legions followed strict routines. Camps were built the same way every time. Discipline was enforced relentlessly. This system produced reliability, but it also produced inflexibility. When enemies adapted faster than Roman command structures, response slowed. orders traveled through layers of authority. Initiative declined. At home, families felt similar pressure. Household authority remained strong in law. Even as social realities changed, women managed businesses. Freed people accumulated wealth, yet legal categories lagged behind lived experience. The rules still assumed older hierarchies. The result was tension between what was permitted on paper and what happened in practice. Religion followed the same pattern. Rituals multiplied. Omens were consulted. Sacred days filled the calendar. The state believed that correct performance preserved favor from the gods. When disasters struck, the response was not reform, but more careful observance. The rules of worship became increasingly detailed, even as faith itself became fragmented. You might think that people eventually rebelled openly against such a system, but rebellion was rare. The rules were not brutal enough to provoke constant resistance. They were exhausting instead. Most people adapted quietly. They complained in private. They bent rules where possible. They focused on survival rather than reform. This quiet endurance is important to understand. Rome did not fall because people stopped obeying rules. It struggled because the rules no longer matched reality. The gap between law and life widened slowly. Administration consumed energy that might have gone toward innovation. Stability became maintenance rather than growth. And yet, these same rules allowed Rome to last far longer than many societies. They prevented constant chaos. They standardized behavior across vast distances. They made daily life predictable enough that millions could coexist. The cost was flexibility. The benefit was endurance. As you sit with this history, you realize that many of these strange Roman rules were not mistakes. They worked, for a time. They addressed real dangers with practical solutions. They reduced noise, fire, hunger, envy, and disorder. They turned excitement into routine. They made boredom a civic virtue. The lesson is not simple. Rules can protect a society, but they can also fossilize it. Too few rules invite chaos. Too many rules invite stagnation. Rome leaned heavily toward control, because control felt safer than uncertainty. When you look around your own world, you may recognize echoes of this logic. Regulations written after disasters, procedures designed to prevent risk, systems that value predictability over imagination. Rome reminds you that such choices are rarely foolish in the moment. They are responses to fear and memory. So the strange rules of ancient Rome were not signs of madness or tyranny alone. They were evidence of a civilization trying very hard to survive itself. The question that lingers is one that Rome never fully answered. When you walk along a Roman road, you are not meant to think about it. That is the first sign that it has done its job well. The stones are fitted tightly, the surface slopes gently, so rainwater moves away instead of pooling. Milestones stand at regular intervals, quietly measuring distance without drama. Nothing here is designed to impress you in the moment. Roman roads were built to disappear into routine, to become so reliable that no one questioned them at all. Yet these roads were among the most powerful tools Rome ever created. Not because they were beautiful, but because they were boring. They turned distance into something manageable. They made time predictable. They allowed orders, goods, soldiers, and information to move with steady confidence. Rome did not conquer the world with roads alone, but it could not have held anything without them. If you lived near one of these roads, your life would have been shaped by it in ways you barely noticed. Travelers passed through your village. Officials arrived on schedule. Taxes were collected efficiently. Soldiers marched past with little ceremony. The road connected you to a larger system that did not care about you personally, but relied on your cooperation all the same. The construction of a Roman road began with careful surveying. Engineers measured land, marked straight lines whenever possible, and chose routes that balanced speed with durability. Hills were cut through, marshes were drained, valleys were crossed with bridges. This work was slow and labor-intensive. Much of it was done by soldiers during peacetime. Building roads kept them occupied, disciplined, and useful, even when no war was being fought. Once built, the road did not maintain itself. This is where the quiet human labor truly begins. Local communities were often responsible for upkeep. Landowners along the road had obligations to repair sections. Officials inspected surfaces and drainage. Stones were reset, weeds were cleared, ditches were cleaned. None of this work was celebrated. No statues were raised for maintenance. But without it, the road would crumble quickly. You might imagine that Rome had a centralized system that carefully managed every mile. In reality, responsibility was fragmented. Some roads were well maintained. Others deteriorated slowly. Weather, traffic, and neglect took their toll. The effectiveness of a road depended as much on local discipline as on imperial ambition. Milestones tell another story. They recorded distances and often named the emperor under whom repairs were made. This was political messaging embedded in stone. The road became a reminder of authority. Even when the surface was worn, the milestone proclaimed that someone was still watching. Order was present, even if imperfect. Along the road, way stations provided rest. Couriers changed horses. Officials ate simple meals. Inns offered shelter of varying quality. These places were regulated, taxed, and inspected occasionally. They were necessary but slightly disreputable. Travelers brought news, rumors, and disease. The road carried risk as well as connection. For soldiers, the road was discipline made physical. Marching pace was measured. Camps were built at predictable intervals. Supply wagons followed set routes. The road removed uncertainty from movement. This reliability allowed Rome to respond to threats with speed that others could not match. For merchants, the road meant opportunity constrained by rules. Toll stations collected fees, weights and measures were inspected. Certain goods required permits. Trade flowed but never freely. The state always watched the road because the road carried wealth. For ordinary people, the road was both useful and intrusive. It brought goods you could not produce yourself. It also brought strangers. Authority arrived more easily. Taxes were harder to avoid. Isolation disappeared. Security increased, but privacy declined. Maintenance was a constant struggle. Floods damaged surfaces. Frost cracked stones. Heavy wagons caused ruts. Local officials reported problems upward, but responses were slow. Resources were limited. Rome relied on tradition and obligation more than innovation. Repairs followed familiar methods, even when conditions changed. As centuries passed, some roads improved while others decayed. New routes were added. Old ones were patched repeatedly. The network grew dense in some regions and thin in others. The road system reflected the uneven priorities of empire. What is striking is how long these roads lasted. Many remain visible today. This endurance was not an accident. It was the result of conservative design, layered construction, and relentless maintenance. Rome built slowly, repaired often, and accepted inconvenience in the present to avoid collapse later. But this system depended on continued effort. When resources declined and attention shifted, maintenance suffered. A road does not fail suddenly. It degrades quietly. Stones loosen. Drainage fails. Travel slows. What was once predictable becomes uncertain. As you stand on a Roman road and listen to the imagined sounds of footsteps, wheels, and hooves, you begin to sense how much of empire rested on this dull surface. Power moved along it. Order depended on it, but it asked something in return. How long could Rome continue the slow, unglamorous work of maintenance before the roads that held everything together began to quietly fall apart? When you follow a Roman road far enough, you begin to notice not just where it goes, but how it changes. Near major cities, the stones are tightly set and frequently repaired. Drainage channels are clear. Milestones stand upright and legible, but as you move farther from centers of power, the road narrows, repairs become uneven. Some stones are missing. Grass pushes through cracks. This gradual decline is not failure, it is evidence of how responsibility thins with distance. Rome never had enough officials to watch every mile. Instead, it relied on obligation. Communities along the road were expected to contribute labor or materials. Landowners were assigned stretches to maintain. Veterans were sometimes settled nearby with the expectation that they would keep routes usable. These arrangements worked only as long as people believed the effort was worth it. For many, the road was both burden and benefit. It brought officials who collected taxes and enforced law. It also brought merchants who bought surplus crops and sold tools, salt and pottery. Maintenance was not framed as service to the empire, but as protection of local stability. A broken road meant fewer visitors, slower response to emergencies, and isolation during famine or conflict. Travel along the road followed strict routines. Couriers of the state moved with official warrants that allowed them to demand fresh horses at stations. This system prioritized government communication over private travel. Ordinary people waited. Merchants adjusted schedules. The road belonged first to authority. This caused resentment, but it also ensured that orders and information moved quickly across vast distances. Waystations became small worlds of their own. Staff lived there permanently, animals were cared for, supplies were stored, records were kept. These places were not glamorous. They smelled of sweat, animals, and damp stone, but they were essential. Without them, the road would have been a long, dangerous stretch of exhaustion. Maintenance crews worked seasonally. Winter damage was assessed in spring. Floods required immediate attention. Repairs used familiar methods even when they were inefficient. Innovation was rare. Rome valued reliability over experimentation. A proven technique, even if slow, was preferred to an untested improvement. This conservatism extended to materials. Stone was chosen for durability, even when timber was cheaper. Layers were built thick. Foundations were heavy. Roads were overbuilt by modern standards. This excess was intentional. Rome did not trust future caretakers. It built in resilience to survive neglect. The military continued to play a role. Soldiers repaired roads while marching. Camps doubled as construction hubs. Tools were standardized. Instructions were repeated generation after generation. This ensured consistency, but it also meant that change came slowly. As the empire aged, funding shifted. Priorities moved to defense, court politics, and immediate crises. Roads that no longer served military needs received less attention. Trade routes changed. Some towns declined. Maintenance obligations became harder to enforce. People questioned why they should repair a road that brought little benefit. The road network did not collapse all at once. It thinned. Some routes remained active. Others became seasonal. Local paths replaced imperial ones. Travel slowed. Information took longer to arrive. Authority felt distant. Yet even in decline, the roads influenced behavior. People settled along them. Markets formed at junctions. Churches later reused the routes. The physical imprint endured long after administration weakened. You begin to understand that Roman roads were not just infrastructure. They were agreements. They represented shared effort across generations. When that agreement frayed, the stones alone could not hold it together. This leads to a quiet realization. The strength of the road system was never in stone or engineering alone. It rested on continued cooperation, obligation, and belief in a shared future. What happens to a civilization when the work required to maintain connection begins to feel heavier than the benefits it brings? As the final centuries of Roman rule unfold, the roads still stretch across the landscape, but their meaning has begun to change. They no longer symbolize confident expansion. Instead, they serve as reminders of past certainty. You can still travel along them, but the journey takes longer. Repairs are patchwork. Some way stations stand empty, others operate only part of the year. The road remains, but the system that once animated it is growing thin. You would notice this first in the movement of information. Messages arrive late, orders are repeated, because earlier ones never reached their destination. Local officials act on outdated instructions. The rhythm that once defined Roman administration loses its precision. The road still exists, but it no longer guarantees speed. Merchants adapt. They rely more on regional trade. Long-distance routes become risky. Banditry increases where patrols are irregular. Inns decline. Travelers move in groups for safety. The road, once a tool of control, becomes a space of uncertainty. Maintenance becomes reactive rather than planned. Repairs happen after failure, not before. A collapsed bridge forces detours. A flooded section is avoided rather than fixed. Each workaround reduces the incentive to restore the original route. The network fragments quietly. Yet the endurance of Roman roads remains remarkable. Many continue to serve local needs. Farmers use them to reach markets. Pilgrims follow familiar paths, even when imperial authority fades. The physical memory of connection persists. The road outlives the empire because it was built to survive neglect. This endurance carries a lesson. Rome invested heavily in the unglamorous. It accepted high initial cost for long-term stability. The roads did not fail quickly, because they were never designed for convenience alone. They were designed for endurance. But endurance without renewal has limits. A system that resists change eventually struggles to respond to new realities. The same conservatism that preserved the roads also slowed adaptation. When priorities shifted, the roads could not adjust themselves. You may notice how later societies reused Roman roads. Medieval travelers walked the same paths. Modern highways follow similar routes. The original logic of connection still holds. Distance still matters. movement still shapes power. As you reflect on the slow work of Roman roads, you realize that their greatest achievement was not conquest, but continuity. They allowed ordinary life to proceed with fewer surprises. They made the world smaller and more predictable. The people who maintained them rarely appear in history. Their labor was repetitive and unnoticed. But without them, the empire would have unraveled far sooner. Stability depended on their quiet persistence. The story of Roman roads is not one of sudden collapse, but of gradual fading. Stones loosen, obligations weaken, attention drifts. What remains is a path that still points forward, even when fewer people follow it. When you look at these ancient roads today, you are not just seeing engineering, you are seeing the accumulated effort of generations who believed that maintenance mattered. And the final question lingers gently, inviting reflection. In your own world, which connections endure because they are carefully maintained, and which are slowly fading because the work has become too easy to ignore? When you step into a Roman bathhouse for the first time, the experience feels almost overwhelming. Heat presses against your skin. Voices echo off stone walls. Water splashes rhythmically. The air smells of steam, oil, and human presence. It does not feel like a place designed for health. It feels social, noisy, and indulgent. Yet beneath this sensory overload lies one of the most effective and understated public health systems of the ancient world. Roman bathhouses were not luxuries reserved only for the elite. They were ordinary, expected, and routine. In many cities, entrance fees were low enough that even the poor could attend regularly. Emperors subsidized baths not out of generosity, but because clean citizens were calmer citizens. Dirt, disease, and neglect bred unrest. Cleanliness encouraged stability. If you lived in Rome or any major provincial city, bathing was part of your weekly rhythm, sometimes even daily. You would not think of it as hygiene in a modern sense. You would think of it as normal life. The bathhouse replaced the private bathroom that most homes lacked. It also replaced isolation with shared routine. The layout of a bathhouse followed a familiar pattern. You entered through changing rooms where clothes were stored. Then came a sequence of rooms with increasing heat. Warm rooms loosened muscles. Hot rooms induced sweating. Cold pools followed to close pores and restore balance. This sequence was not accidental. It was based on long observation of how bodies responded to temperature. Water supply was constant. Aqueducts fed baths continuously. Used water drained away through sewers. This flow mattered. Stagnant water spread disease. Moving water carried waste away. The Romans did not understand microbes, but they understood patterns. Where water flowed, sickness seemed less persistent. Bathing involved scraping oil and dirt from the skin with tools. This removed parasites and grime. Hair was trimmed, wounds were washed. Infections were noticed by others. Illness became visible. A sick body did not hide easily in a culture of communal bathing. This visibility had social consequences. Those with obvious disease might be discouraged from attending. Others sought remedies early. Gossip spread information faster than officials ever could. The bathhouse became an informal surveillance system for health. Rules governed behavior. Certain hours were reserved for different groups. Some baths separated men and women by time or space. Noise levels were tolerated, but not unchecked. Guards enforced order. Violence and theft were punished. The bathhouse had to feel safe to function. Heating systems required constant attention. Fires burned beneath floors. Slaves and workers labored unseen to maintain temperature. This labor was dangerous. Accidents happened, yet the system persisted because the benefits were clear. Warmth soothed bodies. Sweat reduced illness. Regular bathing lowered disease burden. The baths also reduced social isolation. Loneliness weakens resilience. In the bathhouse, news was shared. Disputes were discussed. Complaints were aired. This emotional ventilation mattered. A population that talked together broke less easily. From the state's perspective, bathhouses solved multiple problems at once. They improved cleanliness. They absorbed leisure time that might otherwise turn toward unrest. They reinforced shared identity. Everyone bathed. Everyone followed the same routine. Differences of class softened, if only temporarily. Even in smaller towns, baths appeared early. They were among the first public buildings constructed. Roads, baths, and forums formed a basic package of Romanization. The bathhouse taught people how to live like Romans more effectively than laws ever could. Yet maintaining these baths was expensive. Water had to be supplied. Heating required fuel, repairs were constant. When resources declined, baths suffered, hours were reduced, water flow weakened, cleanliness declined quietly before it disappeared. Still, for centuries, bathhouses functioned as silent guardians of health. They did not cure disease. They reduced its spread. They normalized cleanliness without preaching it. They made health boring and routine. As you sit in the warm air of an imagined Roman bath, listening to voices echo and water move endlessly, you begin to sense that this place was never just about comfort. It was about control, prevention, and habit. And that leaves an unresolved question that lingers beneath the steam. What happens to public health when shared routines of care slowly disappear, one ordinary habit at a time? As you continue to spend time in the Roman bathhouse, you begin to notice patterns that go beyond comfort and routine. The baths do not simply clean bodies. They organize behavior. They shape time. They quietly teach people how to exist together without constant supervision. In a city as crowded and unequal as Rome, this was no small achievement. Bathing followed a shared rhythm. Most people arrived in the late afternoon, after work and before the evening meal. This created a predictable daily cycle. Streets emptied slightly, tensions softened, physical labor gave way to rest. Heat loosened muscles and tempers alike. The bathhouse absorbed energy that might otherwise spill into conflict. This mattered because Rome was always on the edge of unrest. Disease outbreaks, food shortages, and political anxiety could turn frustration into violence quickly. The baths acted as pressure valves. A tired body soaked in warm water is less eager to riot. This was not an accident. Emperors understood this effect, even if they never explained it openly. Inside the bathhouse, hierarchy blurred but did not vanish. Wealthy patrons brought personal attendants. Poorer citizens carried their own oil and tools, but everyone undressed. Everyone shared the same water. This temporary equality reduced resentment. It reminded people that bodies were fundamentally similar, even if lives were not. Health benefits extended beyond cleanliness. Warmth improved circulation. Sweating reduced parasites. Regular exposure to heat and cold strengthened resilience. Minor wounds were washed instead of ignored. Skin conditions were noticed early. Chronic illness became visible. This early detection reduced the spread of infection. There were also rules designed to limit harm. Certain oils were discouraged because they clogged pores. Excessive heat exposure was criticized by physicians. Time limits were sometimes enforced. The baths were indulgent, but not uncontrolled. Roman medicine emphasized balance. Too much of anything weakened the body. Physicians often visited baths to observe patients. Advice was given informally. Remedies were discussed publicly. This made medical knowledge accessible. It also normalized attention to the body. Health was not a private burden. It was a shared concern. Women experienced the baths differently. In some cities, facilities were separate. In others, hours were divided. While restrictions existed, women still benefited from access to clean water and social interaction. Childbirth recovery, skin care, and general hygiene improved. Infant survival rates were affected quietly, without record or ceremony. Children also attended baths. This early exposure created lifelong habits. Cleanliness became normal rather than exceptional. The bathhouse taught behavior through repetition, not instruction. This is one reason the system worked so well. However, the bathhouse was not without risk. Crowds spread illness when epidemics struck. Shared spaces increased exposure. During severe outbreaks, baths were sometimes closed. These closures were rare but significant. They disrupted routine and increased anxiety. People noticed immediately when the baths fell silent. Maintenance challenges increased over time. Aqueducts required repair. Fuel supplies fluctuated. Skilled labor became harder to secure. As budgets tightened, corners were cut. Water was reused longer. Heating was reduced. Cleanliness declined slowly, almost imperceptibly. The decline of baths was not dramatic. They did not burn or collapse all at once. They became colder, less crowded, less reliable. People attended less often. Private solutions replaced public ones for those who could afford them. Inequality returned to the body itself. When the baths weakened, disease spread more easily. Social isolation increased. Information traveled slower. The quiet system that once supported health and order began to unravel. Yet for centuries, the bathhouse had done its work without praise. It did not cure plagues. It prevented countless small illnesses from becoming larger crises. It trained generations to care for their bodies together. As you step back from the steam and noise, you begin to understand that public health is rarely heroic. It depends on habits that feel ordinary. When those habits fade, the consequences appear slowly, often unnoticed until it is too late. This leads to a question that remains unanswered as the water cools and the rooms empty. Can a society protect its health without shared spaces that quietly teach people how to care for themselves and one another? As Roman authority weakened in the later centuries, the bathhouses remained standing, but their purpose slowly drained away. You could still walk through their arched entrances, you could still see steam rise on certain days, yet something essential had shifted. The shared confidence that made these spaces work was fading. The first signs were subtle. Water pressure dropped as aqueducts suffered from neglect or damage. Heating systems failed more often. Repairs took longer. The rooms grew cooler. People stayed for shorter visits. None of this seemed catastrophic on its own. But public health does not collapse dramatically. It erodes quietly. Bath attendants left when wages became unreliable. Skilled workers found safer employment. Knowledge of maintenance routines thinned. Small failures accumulated. A blocked drain here, a cracked floor there. Each defect reduced trust. People attended less frequently, especially during colder seasons. As attendance declined, the bathhouse lost its social power. Fewer conversations meant less information sharing. Illness went unnoticed longer. Disputes moved elsewhere. The pressure valve closed gradually, without announcement. Private bathing increased among the wealthy. Portable tubs appeared in large homes. Cleanliness became a privilege rather than a shared norm. For the poor, options narrowed. Rivers and streams replaced baths, carrying their own risks. Disease spread unevenly. The closure of bathhouses also affected time itself. Daily rhythms changed. Afternoons grew less structured. Leisure fragmented. Without shared routines, communities became quieter and more isolated. This isolation weakened resilience. Medical practice adapted poorly. Without public spaces for observation, physicians relied more on household visits, which favored the wealthy. Knowledge circulation slowed. Preventive care declined. Treatment became reactive. Religion absorbed some functions of the bathhouse. Communal gatherings shifted to churches. Ritual replaced routine. Care focused on the soul more than the body. This shift brought comfort, but it did not replace hygiene. Yet the legacy of Roman baths endured. Medieval bathhouses emerged later, inspired by Roman models. Modern public health rediscovered similar principles. Clean water, shared facilities, and routine hygiene remain foundations of stability. The Roman bathhouse teaches a quiet lesson. Public health succeeds best when it feels ordinary. When cleanliness becomes exceptional, disease follows. When care becomes private, inequality deepens. As you imagine the echoing halls growing silent, you realize that the baths were never just buildings, they were agreements. Agreements to care together, regularly, without spectacle. When those agreements ended, the loss was not immediately visible, but its effects shaped centuries. So the final reflection lingers softly, like steam dissipating into air. In your own time, which shared habits quietly protect health, and what happens when they are allowed to fade into memory? When you imagine a Roman legion, you likely picture motion, marching feet, raised shields, the clash of metal. But if you were actually a soldier in the Roman army, most of your life would be defined not by battle, but by waiting. The legion camp was a place of repetition, restraint, and long stretches of controlled boredom. This boredom was not a failure of the system. It was the system. You lived by routine from the moment you arrived. The camp was laid out in a precise pattern that never changed. Streets crossed at right angles. Tents were placed in identical rows. Command buildings stood at the center. Latrines were positioned downwind. Even before you learned your duties, the space itself taught you order. You did not need signs. The camp told you where you belonged. Each day followed a familiar rhythm. You woke at the same time, you assembled, you drilled, you cleaned equipment, you repaired roads or fortifications, you cooked simple meals, you waited. The repetition was deliberate. Rome believed that predictability produced obedience. An idle soldier was a dangerous soldier. Boredom was safer than freedom. Training filled much of your time. Even experienced soldiers drilled constantly. Weapons practice, formation movement, marching with full gear. None of this felt heroic. It was exhausting and dull, but repetition created reflex. When battle came, there would be no need for thought. The body would already know what to do. The camp itself was rebuilt every time the legion moved. This seems wasteful, until you understand its purpose. Building the camp reinforced discipline. It kept soldiers busy. It ensured security. Ditches were dug, walls were raised, gates were guarded. Each man knew his role. The act of construction reminded you that safety came from collective effort. You slept in shared tents. Privacy was minimal. You learned to tolerate noise, smell, and proximity. Arguments happened, but rules controlled them. Punishments were strict. Disorder threatened the group. Cohesion mattered more than comfort. Food was simple and repetitive. Grain formed the base of most meals. You ground it, you baked it, you ate it again, the next day. Meat appeared occasionally. Wine was watered down. Hunger was managed, not indulged. The goal was endurance, not pleasure. Cleanliness was enforced. Equipment was inspected. Armor was maintained. Neglect brought punishment. This attention to detail extended to personal behavior. Gambling was regulated. Drinking was limited. Relationships were controlled. The army did not trust excess. Pay arrived slowly and irregularly. Deductions were common. Equipment costs were subtracted. Food was not free. Many soldiers ended service with less wealth than expected. The promise of land or citizenship mattered more than daily comfort. Boredom pressed in during long periods of peace. Guards stood watch over nothing. Patrols walked familiar routes. Days blurred together. Stories were told and retold. Superstitions formed. Small routines became anchors of sanity. The army understood this danger. Entertainment was limited, but permitted. Dice games. Simple music, occasional spectacles. But too much distraction weakened discipline. Balance was carefully maintained. Rules governed everything. Where you stood, when you spoke, how you addressed superiors. Punishment was public and memorable. Discipline was not cruel for its own sake. It was preventative. One disobedient soldier endangered everyone. The camp was also a social machine. Men from different regions lived together. Languages blended. Customs merged. The army created a shared identity stronger than local ties. You became a Roman soldier first. Everything else second. This identity required constant reinforcement. Symbols mattered. Standards were guarded carefully. Oaths were repeated. Loyalty was ritualized. The boredom made these rituals more powerful. When nothing else changed, symbols endured. Yet beneath this order lay strain. Long service wore bodies down. Injuries accumulated. Aging soldiers struggled to keep pace. Promotion was slow. Favor mattered. Resentment grew quietly. Still, desertion was rare. The system worked because it enclosed you completely. The camp was your world. Outside it lay uncertainty. Inside it lay routine. As days passed without incident, you might begin to wonder whether this endless preparation was necessary, whether a life spent waiting could truly justify itself, whether boredom was protecting you or consuming you. And so the question lingers, as the camp settles into another identical evening. How long can discipline sustained by routine hold together men whose lives are defined by waiting rather than action? As the days stretch into weeks and months, the monotony of camp life begins to reveal its full influence on a soldier. You start to see that the boredom was never accidental. It was an invisible tool designed to shape behavior, maintain cohesion, and prepare men for a sudden, violent world. Every repetitive task, every regulated moment, every minor inconvenience had a purpose to forge predictability out of chaos. You wake each morning to the same orders. The centurion calls the roll. You answer in turn. A misstep earns a sharp reprimand. Your tent partner wakes at the same time. Together, you perform the ritual of washing, oiling, and dressing in armor that is heavy, uncomfortable, and meticulously maintained. Every piece has a place. Every action has a purpose. This repetition embeds discipline deeper than any lecture or moral exhortation ever could. Meals are functional rather than pleasurable. Grain boiled into a porridge fills your stomach. Occasional salted meat punctuates the monotony. Food serves to sustain, not delight. Yet, even in its dullness, it teaches control. Soldiers learn patience, appreciation for simplicity, and the skill of making do with what is available. These habits carry forward to the battlefield, where comfort is rare and rationing constant. Daily drills take hours. Weapon forms, marching formations, and defensive maneuvers are repeated until they become second nature. You do not question them, you internalize them. Your body learns the rhythm of the legion. Reflex replaces deliberation. A soldier who thrives in chaos is useful only briefly. One who thrives in routine survives consistently. Yet the boredom is not entirely physical. Mental endurance is tested through observation, reporting, and small exercises of authority. You may be assigned to inspect tents, supervise latrines, or count provisions. Each task seems trivial, even tedious, but it reinforces the idea that order is paramount. Small lapses can be catastrophic in battle, so the smallest exercises in diligence are also practice in survival. Sleep is regimented. You share tents with several comrades. Nights are punctuated by watch shifts. The division of labor is strict. Your rest is never complete, but it is predictable. When surprise attacks do occur, your body is already conditioned to function under stress. Boredom and preparation intertwine to build resilience. Social life, while limited, is also tightly controlled. Conversations occur within earshot of superiors. Gossip spreads, but under observation. Friendships develop slowly, because the rules dictate proximity and interaction. Rivalries emerge, but they are mitigated by rituals, shared responsibilities, and the omnipresence of hierarchy. The camp functions as a small, self-regulating society. Punishment is ever present. Minor infractions are noticed and corrected immediately. Theft, disobedience, and sloth are punished in ways designed to teach without eliminating the offender. Corporal punishment, extra duties, and public reprimands reinforce the seriousness of each rule. Discipline is preventative rather than reactive. The Legion understands that chaos is more dangerous than pain. Even leisure is structured. Dice games, singing, and storytelling are allowed within limits. Excess threatens discipline. Absence of activity risks mutiny. Commanders balance amusement and boredom carefully, recognizing that too much or too little both erode order. The careful orchestration of downtime becomes as important as drilling with weapons. The cumulative effect of this routine is subtle but profound. A soldier who endures months of identical days learns patience, focus, and endurance. His mind adapts to monotony. His body adapts to discomfort. His loyalty adapts to hierarchy. The Legion molds individuals into tools of a collective purpose that outlasts personal desire or even fear. And yet, this system creates tension. Repetition breeds longing. Men dream of home. They count days. They measure distance to campaigns and retirements. Small slights, boredom-fueled irritations, and quiet injustices fester beneath the surface. Discipline is maintained, but always with a fragile equilibrium. The paradox is clear. The very monotony that ensures obedience also cultivates subtle rebellion of spirit. Soldiers comply because it is necessary. They endure because survival depends on it. Their energy is consumed not by open conflict, but by the quiet negotiation of patience, desire, and duty. And so you arrive at the lingering question that underscores every march, every drill, every quiet evening in camp. Can a society or an army rely on the dullness of routine alone to prepare its members for moments of extreme crisis? Or does the very repetition that shapes discipline also erode vitality over time? As campaigns unfold, the true impact of camp life becomes visible. Soldiers who have endured months or even years of monotony suddenly find themselves in chaos. The clash of arms, the panic of retreat, the screams of the wounded. Yet the boredom of the camp has prepared them better than any exhilaration ever could. Reflex replaces hesitation. Coordination persists even under fear. Discipline, forged in dull repetition, becomes life-saving instinct. You notice how the system rewards consistency. Men who complained quietly, who tolerated boredom, who performed each task with mechanical precision, survive at higher rates. Those who sought distraction, resisted routine, or cut corners falter when unpredictability arrives. The lessons of waiting and repetition translate directly into battlefield resilience. Yet the cost of this preparation is evident too. Soldiers carry fatigue, both physical and mental. Small injuries compound over time. Emotional wear accumulates. The repetitive life of the camp dulls the imagination and narrows emotional range. Joy is measured in minor comforts, a warm meal, a successful drill, or a brief conversation with a comrade. Excitement becomes dangerous. Excessive pleasure threatens survival, both individually and collectively. When legions move for long campaigns, you see the same routines scaled up. Camps are reconstructed every night. Marching pace is strict. Supply wagons follow designated intervals. Every movement is choreographed. The army functions like a living machine, each soldier a cog within a vast grinding system. Boredom, repetition, and discipline are not incidental, they are essential. You also notice how this system shapes society beyond the camp. Veterans settle in colonies along conquered territories. They carry the habits of order, punctuality, and structured life into towns and farms. Roads, fields, and local governance reflect the same emphasis on routine and control that sustained the legion. Even after battle ends, the imprint of camp life endures. The paradox becomes clear. Boredom, once perceived as tedium, was the foundation of resilience. The army's ability to respond to crises, endure hardship, and maintain cohesion under pressure depended on a long, patient investment in routine. But that same structure limited creativity, personal expression, and adaptability. Soldiers were molded for survival, not for improvisation. This slow, deliberate shaping of behavior explains why Roman legions were effective across centuries. They were not extraordinary because of bravery alone. They were extraordinary because boredom, repetition, and meticulous order prepared ordinary humans to perform extraordinary acts. The dull, daily labor of the camp produced readiness that excitement alone could never achieve. Yet, it also foreshadows challenges. Systems built on monotony struggle to adapt when conditions change faster than routines can adjust. Discipline protects, but rigidity can hinder innovation. The same structures that preserve order in one era may become brittle in another. As you imagine the legion at rest, with soldiers sharpening weapons, repairing tents, or quietly discussing their day, you recognize the quiet genius of the Roman military. It mastered survival through tedium, endurance through routine, and cohesion through boredom. And the reflection lingers, subtle but powerful. Can a civilization or an army truly thrive if its strength is built on monotony, or will the very dullness that protects it also sow the seeds of inflexibility over time? If you walk through the streets of ancient Rome, you might notice something immediately. The city is crowded, noisy, and flammable. Timber frames, wooden beams, thatched roofs, and densely packed insulae, apartment blocks stacked high, create a landscape primed for disaster. Fires are not rare, they are inevitable. Yet Rome survived for centuries, despite this constant threat. How? Partly through fire brigades, regulations, and the relentless effort to prevent catastrophe, even if that effort often felt insufficient. Rome's first organized attempt to fight fire came in the late Republic, around the time of Augustus. Though informal methods existed long before, wealthy citizens sometimes employed slaves to form rudimentary brigades, and water buckets were passed along human chains during small blazes. But these methods were reactive. Fires spread quickly, damage was extensive, prevention was minimal. Wealthy neighborhoods fared better, poorer ones suffered disproportionately. The great turning point arrived when Marcus Licinius Crassus, the famously wealthy politician and businessman, organized one of the first professional fire brigades. Crassus's brigade operated for profit. If a fire broke out, his men would appear and attempt to extinguish it, but only if the property owner agreed to pay. Refusal meant watching your building burn while someone else's wealth was saved. This system, while morally dubious, introduced the principle that organized, trained response could reduce destruction. The brigade itself was a curious mix of discipline and improvisation. Slaves and freedmen formed the core. Buckets, pumps, and hooks were used to tear down buildings, preventing fire from spreading. Hose-like devices existed in primitive form, but water pressure was inconsistent. Firefighting involved risk, skill, and physical endurance. Men were rewarded for bravery and speed, but punished severely for negligence. The brigade operated in a world where mistakes were literal matters of life and death. Roman authorities soon recognized that relying on private brigades was insufficient. Regulations emerged, limiting the height of insulae, controlling the materials used in construction, and requiring wider streets in some districts. Wells, cisterns, and aqueduct-fed reservoirs were positioned to provide water for emergencies. Fire prevention became a civic concern, not just a private one. Despite these measures, Rome's streets remained perilously narrow, and materials remained highly combustible. Fires could consume entire blocks in hours. When the Great Fire of 64 CE broke out under Emperor Nero, more than half the city was destroyed. The response revealed both the strength and weakness of Roman systems. Some areas were saved through organized effort, others burned entirely. Wealthy citizens often escaped with minimal loss, while poor neighborhoods were obliterated. The fire brigades functioned under extreme conditions. Water supply was limited. Roads were crowded. Smoke and heat made coordination difficult. Yet the constant threat of fire created vigilance. Citizens were expected to maintain access to water, keep streets clear, and observe rules regarding fire use in cooking and heating. Violations were punished. Prevention was boring, slow, and tedious, but it saved lives. Even after disasters, Rome rebuilt with similar vulnerabilities. Regulations were revised. Height limits adjusted. Firefighting equipment improved incrementally. Yet the cycle repeated. Fires returned, destruction occurred, and responses were enacted again. The pattern demonstrates a fundamental principle of Roman urban life: constant attention to risk, even when success is never guaranteed. Beyond the immediate danger, fire shaped social dynamics. Wealthy citizens could protect themselves with private brigades and stone houses. Poorer citizens relied on public measures and collective effort. Neighborhoods formed informal watch groups. Communities that organized effectively survived better. Fire became a lens through which inequality, organization, and civic responsibility were visible. Daily life was imbued with awareness. Cooking fires, lamps, and torches were handled carefully. Trades that produced sparks, like blacksmithing, were regulated. Streets were monitored. Rules existed on paper and in practice. Some were enforced rigorously, others were advisory. Citizens adjusted behavior, not out of fear alone, but because compliance made survival possible. And yet, the system was never perfect. Rome relied on a mix of improvisation, ritual, bureaucracy, and practical habit to manage risk. Fire could never be eliminated entirely. The measures in place were not heroic. They were painstaking, dull, and essential. This quiet work, maintenance of aqueducts, inspection of streets, enforcement of codes, training of brigades, created the illusion of control. Without it, the city would have been consumed more frequently. As you imagine standing on a crowded Roman street, buckets in hand, observing smoke curling over rooftops, you begin to understand the balance Rome constantly negotiated. Order existed not through grand gestures alone, but through the tedious, repeated labor of citizens, officials, and brigades alike. Every day required attention. Every corner of the city posed a potential threat. Survival depended on routine. And yet, even with preparation, fire could strike unpredictably. A single careless lamp or cooking accident could overwhelm defenses. A street that had been safe for decades could erupt in flames. The system was robust but fragile, a delicate dance between human effort and unavoidable risk. This leaves you with a quiet, unresolved thought as the smoke drifts skyward and the water buckets pass along the line of people. Could a city ever be fully safe from disaster? Or is the true measure of survival the persistent, boring work of vigilance that most people rarely notice until catastrophe strikes? As Rome recovered from its repeated fires, you begin to notice the painstaking mechanisms that kept the city alive. Survival depended less on heroics and more on dull, consistent labor: inspections, patrols, maintenance of aqueducts, regulation of flammable materials, and training of brigades. The life of the city was a cycle of preparation, enforcement, and repair, repeated endlessly. Fire brigades themselves evolved beyond Crassus's profit-driven model. Under Augustus and later emperors, brigades became more structured, organized as public services. They were divided into units assigned to specific districts, each led by a commander responsible for readiness. Buckets, pumps, hooks, and ladders were stored in strategic locations. Teams drilled regularly, practicing bucket chains and controlled demolitions to create fire breaks. The work was methodical, repetitive, and essential. These brigades functioned as both firefighters and inspectors. They patrolled the city, checking for blocked streets, poorly maintained buildings, and violations of fire regulations. Merchants and residents were reminded to keep water access clear and to handle lamps, fires, and ovens with care. Discipline was strict. Officials fined violators, sometimes confiscated property, and occasionally forced owners to rebuild in safer materials. This relentless oversight created a culture in which minor tasks, the boring work of vigilance, had enormous consequences. Despite these efforts, fires remained a persistent threat. Buildings were close together, and construction standards often lagged behind regulations. Wooden beams, combustible roofing, and tightly packed streets meant that even a small spark could escalate rapidly. During dry summers, when winds swept through crowded districts, flames traveled faster than anyone could react. The city's safety depended on preparation and luck in equal measure. The aqueduct system was central to fire management. Water had to flow constantly, reservoirs needed inspection, and pumps required skilled operation. A single failure could render entire districts defenseless. Maintenance crews, often slaves or lower-class citizens, worked quietly but tirelessly. Their labor was rarely celebrated, yet it prevented the collapse of entire neighborhoods. Without their repetitive, unnoticed effort, Rome's fire defenses would have failed much earlier. Social dynamics also influenced outcomes. Wealthy citizens often built stone houses or paid for private firefighting assistance. Poor residents relied entirely on public measures and collective action. Neighborhood watch systems emerged informally, as residents organized bucket chains and fire watches. Those who neglected preparation suffered disproportionately, reinforcing the link between social responsibility and survival. Fire influenced more than safety. It shaped daily life and urban design. Streets were gradually widened, building materials regulated, and distances between structures enforced where possible. Public fountains, wells, and cisterns were located strategically, balancing utility and risk reduction. Officials mapped risk zones and prioritized brigades accordingly. This was slow, incremental adaptation rather than radical change, but it saved lives over decades. The cumulative effect of these measures was subtle but profound. Residents became conditioned to anticipate danger, respond to small signals, and cooperate in prevention. Knowledge was passed down: do not leave cooking fires unattended, keep streets clear, and maintain access to water. These routines may have seemed trivial, even tedious, but they formed the backbone of urban resilience. Even emperors recognized the limits of control. Nero's Great Fire demonstrated how quickly human effort could be overwhelmed. Entire districts burned despite preparation. What mattered was that Rome's systems prevented repeated collapse of the entire city. Lessons were learned slowly: rebuild streets wider, enforce construction codes, and maintain water supplies more rigorously. Each cycle of disaster and repair reinforced the importance of constant, boring vigilance. The Roman approach to fire illustrates a broader principle. Survival depends not on dramatic heroism alone, but on the accumulation of small, disciplined actions over time. Without the relentless repetition of inspection, patrol, and maintenance, the city would have succumbed repeatedly. Without the quiet labor of fire brigades and ordinary citizens, wealth, life, and urban order would have been far more fragile. As you imagine the smoke rising over crowded insula, and the rhythm of buckets passing along human chains, you sense the delicate balance between preparation and chaos. A single neglected routine could undo years of careful work, and the lingering thought remains, quietly unsettling. How much of any city's survival depends not on grand strategy, but on the tedious, unnoticed habits of countless people who keep danger at bay day after day, often without recognition or reward. By the time you reach the later centuries of Rome, fire brigades had become institutionalized, but also increasingly challenged. The city continued to grow, with new neighborhoods, taller buildings, and denser populations. The work of prevention, once manageable, stretched thin. Patrols could not cover every street. Maintenance crews were overextended. Aqueducts and cisterns sometimes failed. Fire, the ever-present danger, remained a threat despite centuries of organized effort. When fires broke out, the system responded in predictable ways. Brigades raced to the scene, forming bucket chains, using pumps and hooks to demolish buildings and create firebreaks. Officials coordinated efforts, directing labor where it was most needed, yet resources were finite. In poorer districts, residents sometimes watched helplessly as flames consumed entire blocks. In wealthier areas, private intervention often saved homes before public brigades arrived. The inequality in survival was stark, a reflection not only of wealth, but of access to organization, preparation, and vigilance. Fires shaped behavior long before the first spark. Citizens monitored daily routines. Cooking fires, heating, and lamp use were regulated, observed, and corrected when unsafe. Street access was maintained, and flammable materials were controlled, though enforcement varied. Compliance was boring, repetitive, and largely unnoticed, but it prevented countless disasters. Rome's survival depended on these small, unremarkable actions. Without them, the city would have collapsed more frequently, if not entirely. Even with organization, the limits of control were clear. During extreme events, a single mismanaged fire could overwhelm the response. Smoke, wind, and panic hindered coordination. Brigades faced danger themselves. Slaves and freedmen risked life and limb, often unnoticed, to protect the city. Their labor, painstaking, dangerous, and repetitive, was the backbone of urban survival. Recognition was rare. Survival depended on diligence, not glory. Over time, the city adapted slowly. Fire regulations were codified, buildings were rebuilt with safer materials, and streets widened when possible. Aqueducts and reservoirs received more attention. Inspection routines became habitual. But adaptation was incremental. The city's fabric never became immune to fire. Preparation and vigilance had to continue day after day, century after century. Fires also shaped social cohesion. Communities along the same street learned to cooperate. Neighbors assisted each other in bucket chains. Survival depended on collective effort. This embedded civic responsibility into ordinary life. The risk of fire taught Romans that safety required participation, not just individual awareness. What emerges from this long history is a paradox. Rome's fire brigades and regulations prevented total catastrophe, yet they could not eliminate risk entirely. Safety was a process, not a state. It depended on the boring, continuous labor of countless people, officials, soldiers, laborers, and ordinary citizens. Heroism existed, but it was routine, mundane, and cumulative rather than spectacular. As you imagine the smoke rising above the city, the shouts of brigades, the passing of buckets, and the repeated inspections of streets, you understand a fundamental principle of survival. Life in Rome was constantly negotiated with danger. Fire could never be erased. The city's endurance rested on vigilance, repetition, and shared responsibility. It was the quiet, daily acts of preparation that mattered most. And so you are left with a final, reflective thought. How much of the safety, order, and continuity we take for granted in our own cities depends on invisible, repetitive labor, the mundane vigilance that prevents disaster before it arrives, often without recognition or thanks. If you lived in ancient Rome, you might never think about where your bread came from. Yet the city's survival, and the stability of the empire, depended on a complex, largely invisible system of grain supply. The city consumed enormous amounts of grain daily, enough to feed hundreds of thousands of residents, and the logistics behind it were monumental. Rome's ability to prevent famine, manage scarcity, and maintain social order was not built on glory or conquest alone. It was built on planning, discipline, and boring, repetitive work. The first fact to consider is scale. Rome's population varied over time, but during the height of the empire, it may have exceeded 1 million people. Each adult consumed roughly 1 kilo of grain per day in various forms: bread, porridge, and other staples. Multiply that across hundreds of thousands of mouths, and you begin to understand why grain management was a full-time, highly organized effort. This was not a matter of simple trade. It was an ongoing operation of procurement, storage, transport, and distribution that required constant attention. The city relied on both local production and imports. Italy's fertile plains supplied much of the grain, but shipments from Egypt, Sicily, and North Africa were essential, especially when local harvests failed. Grain traveled by sea and river, often hundreds of kilometers, before arriving in Rome. Each shipment was subject to delay, spoilage, theft, or damage. Maintaining reliability required detailed record-keeping, inspections, and scheduling, all managed by administrators who rarely appear in grand historical accounts. Once grain reached Rome, storage became a challenge. Granaries, large, often multi-story buildings, were constructed to hold vast quantities. Careful attention was paid to ventilation, moisture, and rodent control. The Romans understood that a poorly stored harvest could spoil quickly, creating famine and unrest. Maintenance of these granaries required workers to perform repetitive, laborious tasks: rotating stock, inspecting sacks, repairing wooden supports, and cleaning storage floors. These efforts, while unglamorous, were critical to the survival of the city. Distribution of grain was equally structured. The state established the annona, a system of regulated grain allocation to citizens, particularly the poor. Citizens registered to receive their allotments at designated points. Officials oversaw deliveries. Soldiers and laborers transported sacks, counted portions, and ensured compliance with regulations. Missed deliveries or miscounts could lead to unrest, and in a densely packed city like Rome, unrest could escalate quickly. The logistics extended to timing. Grain had to arrive predictably. Officials coordinated shipments with harvest seasons, weather patterns, and naval schedules. Ships had to be loaded carefully to prevent spoilage. Rivers and ports were monitored to ensure smooth offloading. Everything was subject to bureaucratic oversight. The system was dull, repetitive, and highly detailed, but it worked because attention to detail was non-negotiable. Socially, grain distribution served multiple purposes beyond feeding the population. It reinforced the legitimacy of the state. Public distribution demonstrated that the government could provide. Citizens who received their rations were reminded of their dependence on Rome. Control over food supply was a form of social control, a quiet but effective method of maintaining order in a city where scarcity could provoke riots. Yet, the system was vulnerable. Bad harvests, piracy, storms, or mismanagement could disrupt supply. Officials had to plan for redundancy, multiple sources, backup storage, and contingency plans for transportation failures. The work was painstaking, rarely celebrated, and largely invisible to those who benefited from it. Citizens saw bread on their plates, not the weeks of labor that ensured it arrived. Even within households, awareness of grain scarcity shaped behavior. Families learned to store small reserves, bake efficiently, and ration carefully during shortages. Urban markets reflected this preparation. Prices fluctuated, and savvy shoppers timed purchases. Ordinary Romans engaged with the supply chain in small, repetitive ways that mirrored the larger system's discipline. The grain system also shaped Rome's political life. Popular unrest was often linked to scarcity rather than ideology. A delayed shipment could trigger protests, demonstrations, and sometimes violence. Emperors and magistrates monitored supply closely, knowing that maintaining bread flow was as vital to stability as military strength. The annona, dull as it seemed, was the backbone of social peace. As you imagine walking through the bustling granaries, hearing the shuffle of sacks and the measured commands of overseers, you begin to see the hidden life of Rome. Survival depended not on sudden heroics, but on careful planning, meticulous repetition, and attention to countless small details. The city lived on the quiet labor of administrators, laborers, sailors, and citizens all cooperating in a vast, boring system. And yet, even with this careful orchestration, uncertainty remained. Harvests could fail, ships could be lost, and riots could erupt. The city's survival was never guaranteed, only managed through relentless effort. Which leaves you with a lingering, unsettling question. How would you react if the stability of your city, or even your own life, depended entirely on a system of dull, repetitive work that most people never notice until it fails? As you step deeper into the machinery of Rome's grain supply, you begin to notice that it is not merely a network of warehouses, ships, and markets. It is a web of constant monitoring, adjustment, and labor that keeps the city alive. What appears to outsiders as simple bread distribution is, in reality, a delicate balance maintained through endless routine, bureaucratic oversight, and unglamorous diligence. Officials oversaw every step of the system. When grain ships arrived at ports like Ostia, clerks inspected manifests, sacks were counted, weighed, and stored in warehouses or granaries. Teams of laborers rotated stock to prevent spoilage, repaired damaged containers, and cleaned storage floors. The smell of grain, dust, and straw was constant. Workers labored long hours in repetitive motions that ensured months of food could last the city. Without such meticulous care, disaster was immediate and visible. Rats, mold, and rot spread swiftly, reducing supplies dramatically. The annona, the public grain distribution system, required careful timing and coordination. Citizens were allotted grain according to registration, and officials supervised collection points to prevent theft or cheating. Soldiers often enforced order, moving through markets and granaries to maintain discipline. Any miscount, delay, or miscommunication could trigger unrest. In a city of hundreds of thousands, even minor inefficiencies could escalate into chaos. Transportation of grain demanded precision. Ships crossing the Mediterranean were vulnerable to storms, piracy, and spoilage. River transport carried its own risks. Seasonal floods, low water levels, or damaged canals could delay deliveries. Each shipment required planning for contingencies, backup vessels, alternative routes, and emergency stores in granaries. The system thrived not because danger was absent, but because preparation was constant and meticulous. Local markets mirrored this careful oversight. Bakers, millers, and vendors interacted with officials to ensure that grain moved efficiently from storage to bread. Quality control was enforced indirectly. Stale or spoiled grain could be rejected, fines could be levied, and vendors' reputations depended on compliance. Citizens were rarely aware of the complexity behind the loaf they purchased daily. What they saw was reliable supply, a quiet reassurance that the system was working. Social implications of the grain supply were profound. Food distribution reinforced civic loyalty and social hierarchy simultaneously. The poor relied on public grain, wealthier citizens supplemented their rations with private purchases. A delay or failure affected the vulnerable disproportionately, but it also reminded all citizens that the government and by extension the emperor was responsible for urban stability. In this way, bread became a tool of social control as much as survival. Seasonal adjustments were constant. Officials tracked harvests, predicted shortages, and ordered shipments from distant provinces. Drought, locusts, or political unrest in Sicily, Egypt, or North Africa required rapid adaptation. Granaries were tapped or stock rotated. Laborers worked tirelessly, moving, counting, and documenting sacks. The work was tedious, exhausting, and invisible, yet each action ensured that the city would wake the next morning with bread on the table. Even small households adapted to this rhythm. Families stored minor reserves, monitored local markets, and rationed flour during shortages. Urban residents became intimately familiar with the patterns of supply, when prices rose, when bakeries were busy, and when officials appeared at distribution points. Daily life was intertwined with the larger logistical machine, often without conscious awareness. And yet, fragility remained. Delays, theft, spoilage, or natural disasters could still create scarcity. Food riots were common enough to require preparedness. Soldiers, officials, and citizens all played a role in preventing panic. The system functioned not because of heroic intervention, but because countless dull, repetitive tasks were performed with consistency and care. As you walk through granaries, imagine the countless hands moving sacks of grain, the clerks checking weights and inventories, and the laborers performing repetitive, exhausting tasks day after day. Each mundane action carries enormous weight. The survival of millions depends on this steady rhythm, and so the unresolved thought lingers. How much of our own modern comfort, our steady supply of food, our city's stability, depends on work so routine and invisible that we rarely notice it until it falters catastrophically? As the centuries progressed, Rome's grain system proved both resilient and fragile, a combination that defined the empire's ability to endure crises. When everything functioned correctly, millions ate without thought, markets remained stable, and unrest was minimal. But beneath this apparent normalcy lay a constant tension. The city's survival depended on meticulous attention to detail, repeated endlessly by people whose labor was largely invisible. Failures were inevitable. Ships sank in storms, grain spoiled despite careful storage, clerks miscounted shipments, local officials mismanaged distribution. Even a small lapse could cascade rapidly. When shortages occurred, citizens' patience thinned. Hunger was immediate and public. Riots erupted in streets, targeting bakeries, granaries, and even officials themselves. In these moments, the dull work of maintenance became heroic, and its absence starkly felt. Yet the system's design mitigated the worst outcomes. Multiple supply sources created redundancy. Granaries across the city stored reserves that could be tapped in emergencies. Redistribution mechanisms moved grain from areas of surplus to those of scarcity. Laborers, officials, and soldiers coordinated responses swiftly, relying on routines established over decades. The repetition, so tedious in normal times, became a stabilizing force in moments of crisis. Maintenance of the system was continuous. Granaries were inspected for rodents, rot, and leaks. Laborers rotated stock, repaired damaged containers, and cleaned storage floors. Ships were loaded and unloaded according to precise schedules. Documentation was constant, ensuring that shortages or surpluses could be identified immediately. It was the accumulation of small, repetitive actions that allowed Rome to feed millions reliably, even in the face of natural disaster or political upheaval. Social consequences were clear. Citizens became dependent on the state for a portion of their survival. The annona, while mundane in daily operation, reinforced civic loyalty. Families knew that compliance with registration and orderly collection was necessary to receive grain. Cooperation became a cultural habit, embedded in routines, neighborhood practices, and personal planning. Even in rebellion or unrest, the relationship between population and supply shaped behavior. Hunger was as much political as it was physical. Over time, the grain system left lasting legacies. Former soldiers, bureaucrats, and laborers brought knowledge of logistics and storage to provincial towns. Merchants learned how to manage risk, maintain reserves, and coordinate shipments. The methods refined in Rome influenced urban centers across the Mediterranean, embedding habits of discipline, planning, and risk management that endured long after the empire itself fragmented. The paradox of the system is profound. It was boring, tedious, invisible, and yet it sustained one of the largest urban populations the world had ever seen. Heroism existed, not in battle but in routine. Clerks counting sacks, sailors navigating storms, laborers rotating grain, officials ensuring compliance. Each act, repeated day after day, accumulated into survival. Without it, famine, chaos, and unrest would have become the norm. As you imagine the movement of grain through docks, warehouses, streets, and bakeries, you see the empire not as a spectacle of conquest or politics, but as a living organism maintained through dull, patient, and consistent labor. Every loaf of bread carried the weight of countless repetitive actions, each one crucial, each one unnoticed. And so you are left with the quiet, reflective question that underscores the story. How many of the conveniences and security we take for granted today, our food, our order, our stability, depend on invisible, repetitive work, without which society would unravel in ways we rarely consider until it is too late? If you walked through the streets of ancient Rome, you might notice fountains, public baths, private homes, and bustling markets, all reliant on a single invisible force: water. The aqueducts, those long arched channels stretching across hills and valleys, delivered fresh water to millions of people. Yet this achievement was far from glamorous in daily life. The aqueducts' true wonder lay not in their stone arches or engineering elegance, but in the dull, constant maintenance, inspection, and regulation required to keep the city alive. Rome's dependence on aqueducts was absolute. The city's population, perhaps 1 million or more during the empire's height, required millions of liters of water each day. Citizens needed it for drinking, cooking, bathing, sanitation, and industry. Baths alone consumed vast quantities, while fountains and ornamental pools distributed water across public spaces. Without a reliable supply, hygiene faltered, disease spread, and social unrest grew. Water was not just convenience, it was survival. Aqueducts originated in the early Republic, but reached their full scale under emperors like Augustus and Claudius. They were engineered to use gravity alone, transporting water across miles of uneven terrain with remarkable precision. Bridges, tunnels, and inverted siphons were constructed to maintain a steady flow. At first glance, they appear static, monumental, and permanent. But the real story is far less dramatic. Aqueducts required constant attention to continue functioning. Maintenance was an ongoing, repetitive task. Workers inspected channels daily, clearing debris, repairing leaks, and removing mineral deposits that could block flow. Aqueducts were susceptible to erosion, sediment buildup, and structural fatigue. If a single segment failed, water could be interrupted across the city. The workforce, mostly slaves, freedmen, and laborers under engineers, performed dull, repetitive tasks that ensured millions of people received clean water daily. Their work was invisible, yet indispensable. Water regulation was equally meticulous. Officials monitored intake, flow rates, and distribution carefully. Channels were divided into sections, each feeding different neighborhoods, baths, and public buildings. Any misallocation could leave districts without water, and shortages sparked tension or riots. The annona and other bureaucratic systems coordinated with aqueduct management to prioritize essential functions like food preparation, sanitation, and firefighting. Every liter was accounted for in a city that had no natural reservoirs capable of sustaining its population. The aqueducts also shaped daily life in subtle ways. Fountains became gathering points, where people socialized, washed clothes, or filled containers for home use. Baths depended entirely on steady water flow. A delay of hours could disrupt routines, creating tension or discomfort. Citizens internalized the rhythms of supply, learning to plan around availability. Water became a structuring principle of urban existence, quietly dictating habits and behaviors. Maintenance challenges were continuous. Mineral-rich water deposited limestone, forming hard scale that needed chipping or scraping. Wooden sluices rotted, lead pipes corroded, sometimes introducing toxins. Laborers descended into tunnels, climbed arches, and braved high channels to ensure flow remained uninterrupted. Inspectors documented every defect. The work was monotonous, repetitive, and dangerous, but essential for the city's functioning. The aqueduct system also demonstrates the interdependence of civic infrastructure. Water supported sanitation, which controlled disease. Clean water enabled bathing, which reduced infection and promoted social cohesion. It fueled fountains and ornamental spaces, reinforcing civic pride and cultural norms. A single failure blocked channel, broken pipe, or neglected reservoir had cascading effects across daily life. Rome survived because these invisible systems were maintained continuously, not because of any single heroic effort. Yet vulnerability remained. Droughts, earthquakes, and human error could disrupt the supply. Minor lapses might go unnoticed for weeks, slowly degrading quality or quantity. Over time, the cumulative wear of centuries required increasingly intensive oversight. Engineers documented repairs, laborers performed repetitive tasks, and officials coordinated allocation. The system's success was grounded in the persistence of dull, unseen labor more than in dramatic engineering alone. Walking along a channel, you notice small details: mortar flaking, water trickling, sediment forming at corners. Each element requires attention. Each small repair prevents catastrophe. The system appears permanent, yet it exists entirely because of human diligence, day after day, decade after decade. Without routine labor, the arches would crumble, water would fail, and the city's life, public health, social rituals, commerce would be disrupted instantly. And so you are left with a quiet, unresolved thought. Could any city truly thrive without the invisible, repetitive labor that channels, cleans, and distributes water, sustaining life in ways most residents never notice until it is too late? As you examine the aqueduct system more closely, it becomes clear that its survival depended on a network of invisible actors performing repetitive, often tedious work. Engineers, clerks, and laborers coordinated a flow of millions of liters every day, ensuring that the city's immense population remained hydrated, sanitary, and functional. Their labor was not celebrated in history books the way conquests or political reforms were, yet without it, Rome would have collapsed under the weight of its own growth. Maintenance routines were rigorous. Channels were inspected daily, often by laborers who walked the length of the aqueduct, removing debris, repairing leaks, and chipping away mineral deposits that accumulated as water flowed over stone. These deposits, primarily calcium carbonate, could slowly block channels if left unchecked. Even a small obstruction might reduce flow to critical districts. The work was repetitive and exhausting. Scraping stone for hours, climbing arches, crawling through narrow tunnels, mistakes had immediate consequences. Officials oversaw the allocation of water meticulously. Flow rates were calculated to match demand, ensuring baths, fountains, private households, and markets all received adequate supply. Engineers monitored cistern levels, measured inflows from distant rivers, and adjusted gates to distribute water evenly. Any miscalculation could leave neighborhoods dry, triggering tension or unrest. In a city where daily life depended entirely on reliable water, these small procedural tasks carried immense social weight. Aqueducts were vulnerable to environmental and human threats. Drought reduced inflows from distant sources. Earthquakes cracked channels and bridges. Lead pipes corroded, sometimes introducing subtle health hazards. Maintenance crews had to anticipate problems before they became crises, often relying on routine inspections, detailed records, and years of accumulated knowledge. The system's resilience depended not on flashy interventions, but on the quiet repetition of small, precise actions. Daily life in Rome revolved around the rhythms created by water supply. Public fountains were not merely decorative, they were meeting points, laundry stations, and sources of drinking water. Baths depended on steady flow, with heating systems timed to coincide with availability. Merchants planned deliveries around water access. Families rationed domestic use when supply slowed. Citizens internalized the system's schedule, adjusting their routines to the invisible heartbeat of aqueduct flow. The scale of coordination is staggering. Water from distant sources, sometimes dozens of kilometers away, passed through multiple channels, tunnels, and siphons, controlled by a combination of manual gates and stonework. Teams of laborers performed the same inspections day after day, from one aqueduct to another, monitoring flow and repairing minor defects before they escalated. The repetition, dull as it seemed, ensured reliability. Without this labor, the city would face immediate shortages, poor sanitation, and outbreaks of disease. The aqueduct system also illustrates the integration of infrastructure with social and political life. Water distribution reinforced hierarchy and civic responsibility. Certain neighborhoods received priority, reflecting social and political considerations. Public baths and fountains offered controlled access to hygiene, while private estates often supplemented municipal supply. Officials monitored compliance, resolved disputes, and coordinated with grain distributions and fire prevention systems. The city functioned as a living organism, where the uninterrupted flow of water was essential to its health. And yet, The system's vulnerability was constant. Even with careful attention, unpredictable events, storms, structural failures or vandalism could disrupt supply. The repetition and routine of inspection were the city's insurance against chaos. Rome survived because millions of small, dull actions were performed daily with discipline and care. Heroism existed in the form of diligence, not spectacle. Walking alongside an aqueduct, you notice the thin trickle of water against stone, the moss accumulating in shaded corners, and the small repairs tucked into hidden channels. Each element represents hours of repetitive labor. Each minor repair prevents failure. The system seems eternal, yet it is sustained entirely by human effort repeated over decades. And so you are left with the lingering question: could any large city, ancient or modern, truly endure without the persistent, invisible labor that maintains essential infrastructure, even when success is silent and largely unnoticed? By the time the Roman Empire reached its peak, the aqueduct system had become both monumental and delicate. On the surface it appeared permanent: arches spanning valleys, channels running across hills, cisterns storing vast quantities of water. Yet beneath this grandeur lay a reality that was far less glamorous. The city's survival depended on the endless repetitive labor of countless individuals performing tedious inspections, minor repairs, and adjustments that kept the water flowing. Failures were always a threat. A blocked channel could deprive an entire district of water. Collapsed arches or broken pipes could interrupt supply for weeks. Even minor leaks reduced pressure, affecting baths, fountains, and sanitation. Laborers, often slaves or freedmen, climbed treacherous heights to patch cracks, clear sediment, and repair sluices. Engineers meticulously documented every inspection and repair, calculating flow rates to ensure distribution remained stable. Every small task mattered. Water was more than a resource. It shaped society. Public baths required steady supply, and without them hygiene suffered, leading to outbreaks of disease. Fountains provided drinking water and social spaces. Markets, workshops, and bakeries depended on consistent delivery for daily operations. Citizens timed their routines around aqueduct supply, demonstrating how infrastructure quietly dictated behavior, social interaction, and urban culture. The repetitive labor of maintenance enabled all of this. Political stability was intertwined with aqueduct performance. Officials understood that water shortages could trigger unrest. In a densely packed urban environment, lack of access meant frustration and tension. The city's rulers monitored the system carefully, coordinating laborers, inspectors, and engineers. The emperor's authority, in subtle ways, depended on these ordinary, uncelebrated acts of diligence. When the aqueducts functioned flawlessly, life seemed natural and inevitable. When they faltered, the consequences were immediate and visible. The aqueduct's longevity was remarkable precisely because of routine. Repetition ensured reliability. Laborers performed the same inspections daily, channels were cleaned regularly, repairs were incremental but persistent. Each minor action contributed to a system capable of sustaining millions of people over centuries. Heroism in this context was quiet, unspectacular, and cumulative. Without it, Rome would have faced collapse not through conquest, but through neglect. The system also had its limitations. Earthquakes, subsidence, and natural wear demanded constant vigilance. A single overlooked crack could escalate, causing interruption. Droughts reduced inflows, requiring rationing and prioritization. Coordination with other civic functions like grain distribution and firefighting was essential. The survival of the city was never guaranteed. It was earned daily through diligence and repetition. Walking along the channels, you notice the quiet labor that sustains life. Water trickling steadily, minor repairs tucked into arches, guards monitoring key points, clerks noting flow and pressure. Each small, repetitive task keeps the city alive. Each unnoticed action prevents catastrophe. The aqueducts, for all their architectural grandeur, are ultimately monuments to the boring, relentless work that underpins civilization. And so the reflection lingers, subtle and instructive. Could human societies, ancient or modern, truly endure without the persistent, invisible labor that keeps essential systems running? And do we recognize that our survival often depends on countless repetitive acts performed far from glory or recognition? If you think of the Roman Empire, you probably imagine legions marching, grand victories, and political intrigue. But what truly held the empire together was far less glamorous roads. Endless, straight, and meticulously constructed, Roman roads connected cities, ports, and military outposts across vast distances. Their function may seem dull at first glance, but the survival and coherence of the empire depended on these thoroughfares and the careful, repetitive work that maintained them. Rome's roads were more than dirt tracks. They were carefully engineered with layers of stone, sand, and gravel, crowned in the center for drainage, lined with curbs, and often reinforced with milestones marking distances. Construction required precise measurements, coordination of labor, and strict adherence to standards. Engineers oversaw projects that stretched for miles, ensuring that the roads remained functional in all seasons. A poorly built or neglected road could disrupt communication, trade, and military movements, with consequences far beyond inconvenience. The scale of the system was staggering. At the empire's height, estimates suggest that over 80,000 kilometers of roads crisscrossed Roman territory. They linked major cities to remote outposts, ports to markets, and military garrisons to the heart of the empire. Every road required ongoing maintenance, potholes repaired, drainage cleared, stones reset, and wear from carts and foot traffic monitored. The work was repetitive, physically demanding, and often unnoticed by those who traveled them. Military efficiency depended on these roads. Legions could march hundreds of kilometers with predictable speed. Supplies reached front lines reliably, and orders traveled quickly from Rome to distant provinces. Couriers, known as cursus publicus, relied on well-maintained roads to deliver messages, often relaying information across hundreds of kilometers in days rather than weeks. The system was methodical and disciplined. Relay stations provided fresh horses, measured distances, guided navigation, and bureaucrats documented movement. Every detail was mundane, but the result was extraordinary coordination. Civilian life relied on the same infrastructure. Merchants transported grain, wine, olive oil, and other goods along these roads. Travelers, pilgrims, and migrants moved predictably between towns. Markets flourished because supply lines were reliable. The empire's wealth and stability depended on this network of roads and the repetitive labor required to build, monitor, and repair them. Without it, trade slowed, towns became isolated, and urban centers could not sustain large populations. Maintenance routines were strict. Local communities were often responsible for sections of road, repairing damage from weather, erosion, and traffic. Stones were reset, gravel replaced, and drainage cleared. Officials inspected key stretches regularly. Laborers, sometimes slaves, sometimes conscripts, worked long hours in predictable, repetitive patterns to ensure continuity. The labor was tedious but essential. Any neglect could ripple across the empire. Roads also enforced social and political order. Milestones and way stations allowed the state to monitor movement. Couriers carried official messages that reinforced imperial authority. Military patrols used roads to respond quickly to unrest. Citizens internalized the predictable presence of state infrastructure, and compliance with local road maintenance laws became another way ordinary Romans participated in the system that sustained the empire. Even the placement of roads reflected careful planning and boring, meticulous work. Routes were surveyed, gradients measured, and curves minimized to allow consistent travel. Terrain was adapted, hills cut, marshes bridged, rivers spanned. This labor was repetitive and dangerous, but it produced a network that made control, commerce, and communication possible across continents. And yet, despite careful construction, roads required constant vigilance. Heavy rains washed away gravel, carts displaced stones, and tree roots damaged surfaces. Inspection and maintenance never ended. The system worked because individuals repeatedly executed small, dull tasks, ensuring that miles of road remained serviceable for legions, merchants, and citizens alike. As you walk along a well-worn Roman road, you notice the small details: stones carefully aligned, drainage channels channeling rainwater, mile markers etched into rock. Each represents hours of repeated labor. Each mundane task contributes to the empire's cohesion. Without this persistent effort, the extraordinary reach of Rome, its armies, trade, and administration, would collapse into chaos. And so you are left with a quiet question. Could any empire, ancient or modern, survive the distances, logistics, and communication demands of civilization without the boring, repetitive work that maintains its infrastructure day after day, largely invisible to those who benefit most? As you move deeper into the workings of Rome's roads, the complexity of the system becomes clear. Roads were not simply paved paths. They were living arteries of the empire, requiring constant attention, oversight, and repetitive labor. Their maintenance was dull, unglamorous work, but without it, the flow of armies, goods, and information would falter, threatening the cohesion of the empire itself. Local communities bore responsibility for upkeep. Magistrates issued directives, mandating that certain stretches of road be maintained by residents, often in rotation. Stones displaced by carts or weather had to be reset, potholes filled, and drainage channels cleared. Laborers, frequently conscripted or slaves, performed these repetitive tasks daily. Each repair was minor, often invisible to passers-by, yet cumulatively essential to keep travel reliable. A single neglected mile could delay armies, shipments of grain, or official correspondence. The military relied heavily on these well-maintained routes. Legions marched predictably along the straight roads, allowing command to anticipate arrival times, coordinate supplies, and position troops strategically. Relay stations along the roads supported couriers who carried official decrees, tax records, and intelligence reports across hundreds of kilometers. These stations required staff, animals, and supplies, all monitored through repetitive procedural tasks. The military's remarkable efficiency depended on these mundane routines rather than individual heroics. Commerce was equally dependent. Merchants transporting grain from Sicily, olive oil from Hispania, or wine from Gaul relied on predictable roads to ensure timely delivery. Markets across the empire flourished because roads allowed products to arrive in good condition. Bakers, traders, and consumers in Rome depended on the invisible chain of repetitive work, repair crews, bridge inspectors, and surveyors, to ensure that trade continued uninterrupted. Without these routines, food scarcity, price spikes, and social unrest would have been inevitable. Inspection and regulation were ongoing. Officials measured road width, assessed wear, and coordinated repairs. Bridges were inspected for erosion or structural weakness. Drainage channels were monitored to prevent flooding. Even small deviations could cause long-term damage if left unattended. The work was tedious and often thankless, yet it created the reliability upon which the empire's administration, commerce, and daily life depended. Roads also shaped the social fabric of Rome. Milestones recorded distances and reinforced the emperor's authority, subtly reminding travelers of the state's oversight. Way stations provided predictable resting points for travelers, merchants, and officials. Patrols along key routes maintained security. Citizens internalized these routines, adapting travel, trade, and migration patterns around the structured network that roads imposed. What seems mundane, the placement of a stone, the clearing of a ditch, became the backbone of societal stability. Environmental challenges required constant vigilance. Rain eroded surfaces, frost shifted stones, and vegetation encroached. Repair crews followed established routines to mitigate these effects before they threatened usability. Even the repetition of inspection, cleaning, and stone laying was part of a larger orchestration that ensured continuity across hundreds of miles. It is striking to realize that the vast, enduring Roman network relied not on grand acts, but on countless hours of repetitive, precise labor. And yet, vulnerabilities remained. Heavy traffic, unexpected floods, and localized neglect could slow movement or isolate regions. Despite meticulous planning, the roads required human attention constantly. Their reliability was not inherent to the stones or arches themselves. It existed because of the quiet, repetitive labor of engineers, laborers, magistrates, and local citizens performing the same tasks day after day. Walking along these roads, you notice small details, perfectly aligned stones, subtle drainage gradients, and the occasional repaired section where laborers patched damage from the previous winter. Each minor intervention represents hours of repeated effort that collectively ensured the empire's survival, and the question remains, quietly compelling. How much of civilization's reach, its armies, commerce, communication, and stability, depends on repetitive, uncelebrated work, and what would happen if that invisible labor faltered even for a single season? By the later centuries of the empire, Rome's roads had become both monumental and fragile. On the surface, they appeared permanent, straight avenues stretching for miles, stone bridges spanning rivers, and mile markers guiding travelers across the empire. Yet underneath this appearance of stability lay a truth often overlooked. The functioning of this vast network relied entirely on persistent, repetitive labor. The survival of the empire, its armies, trade, and administration depended on it. Maintenance never ceased. Laborers inspected stretches of road daily or weekly, repairing displaced stones, clearing drainage channels, and trimming vegetation that could impede travel. Bridges were checked for erosion and reinforced when necessary. Surveys recorded shifts in gradient or alignment. The work was repetitive and dull, yet each task prevented minor issues from escalating into catastrophic disruptions. Without it, armies would face delays, trade would stall, and communication across the empire would falter. The military, of course, depended on these routines. Legions marched along the roads with predictable speed, relying on stable surfaces and relay stations for rest and supplies. Delays could compromise strategic positioning, reduce supply efficiency, or even endanger lives. Couriers, tasked with carrying official decrees, intelligence and tax records, relied on the same roads. Every broken stone or clogged drainage channel could have ripple effects, illustrating that the empire's power was as much logistical as it was martial. Civic life also depended on these roads. Merchants transported food, textiles, and luxury goods. Travelers moved between towns, local economies relied on predictable access. Markets functioned smoothly because roads allowed timely delivery and collection. Neighborhoods connected by well-maintained roads were safer, wealthier, and more socially cohesive. Roads were thus not simply physical constructs. They were instruments of order, economy, and social stability, maintained by a continuous rhythm of mundane labor. Administrative oversight reinforced this system. Magistrates issued orders for repairs, coordinated resources, and documented conditions. Waystations provided controlled resting points, and patrols maintained security. Even minor lapses could cause bottlenecks or localized unrest. The work of engineers and laborers, repeated day after day, ensured the cohesion of an empire that spanned continents. Heroism was quiet, invisible, and cumulative, expressed through discipline and diligence rather than battle or rhetoric. Environmental factors remained a constant challenge. Rain, frost, and vegetation threatened the integrity of the roads. Local populations, often conscripted for maintenance duties, performed repetitive tasks, realigning stones, filling ruts, repairing bridges, and clearing drainage. These actions, tedious though they were, maintained a network capable of supporting one of the largest empires in history. Without the invisible labor that kept roads serviceable, the empire's reach, influence, and very survival would have faltered. And yet, for all the skill and coordination, vulnerability persisted. A neglected mile could slow trade. A collapsed bridge could cut off entire regions. Disruptions, even temporary, tested the empire's ability to respond. What seems like a minor, boring task, realigning a single stone or clearing a small ditch, had consequences that could cascade across continents. Civilization, in this sense, was always precarious, maintained by uncelebrated repetition. Walking along a well-worn Roman road, you notice the small details: carefully placed stones, smooth gradients, repaired sections where laborers patched winter damage. Each subtle intervention represents hours of repetitive labor that collectively allowed the empire to function. The reach of Rome, its armies, commerce, and administration, was not built solely on conquest, rhetoric, or law, but on the mundane, relentless work of countless hands, repeated across generations. And so, the reflection remains. Quiet, but profound. Could any civilization, ancient or modern, truly endure without the invisible, repetitive labor that maintains its infrastructure? And do we ever recognize how much of our own daily comfort depends on such uncelebrated diligence?